Okay. Chapter 9 continued. We are in the first, 1970, 1971. And The Who was a band that they weren't quite part of the um, British invasion. I mentioned this before when we heard I Can See for Miles. And um, so they kind of wound up in the shadow to a degree of the Beatles and the Stones, but they didn't click in the States as early as the Beatles and the Stones did. They were not over here really until 65, 66, 2 years at least into the British invasion. Um, the Who would be incredibly popular, remain so, one of the great, great, great rock acts. Hard rock, never metal really, but definitely hard rock. Great song from 1970, one of the Who's absolute classics called Baba O'Reilly. Also from 1970, a guy named Iggy Pop, Iggy Pop, Pop, who would be closely associated with David Bowie for a variety of reasons. But Iggy Pop was had a band called the Stooges, and the Stooges were, for lack of a better term, I guess you would call it sort of angry rock. It was loud, it was fast, and it was a precursor for what would come to be known as punk music almost 10 years later. 1970, quite a year, and the Stooges put out a song called 1970. 1970 Stooges. It was a definitely a raw style. And it was interesting for that time because not a lot of bands were going sort of that far out. The Stooges were not mainstream popular in the way that even The Who was, but in terms of what they did for rock history, they opened up the doors to bands that would come down the road 5 to 10 years later. Everybody from the New York Dolls to the Clash, sort of owe a nod to in the Stooges direction. Okay, also happening in 1970, there was the case of urban blight. And urban blight, big cities, predominantly the large industrial cities of the Midwest and the Northeast, were losing people in droves. They were kind of they were being run into the ground because they had lost their base of identity and their base of economy. And that was when we went from a manufacturing society to a more information and service driven society. Lots of cities from Boston and cities, Newark, New Jersey, Baltimore, Buffalo, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and then St. Louis, Milwaukee, cities in the Midwest, Chicago to a degree. Um, they all suffered. They lost St. Louis, lost a lot of people. Some of them still haven't recovered. Cities like Buffalo and Cleveland and St. Louis are half the size they once were. Um, and the key things that happened in the early 1970s is the only people who were left living in these cities were, quite frankly, people who couldn't afford to leave. And that meant people who were on the downside of advantage, a lot of people of color, and a lot of people living below the poverty line. The African American communities of these cities, in particular, were very hard hit by unemployment, rampant drug problems, pervasive crime, And those kinds of concerns were the focus of a lot of art being done during this time. Our old friends from the Motown days, the Temptations, they took the mantle and ran with it. The idea of urban blight and the idea of people being on the economic downside. Ball of Confusion, great Temptation song from 1970, talks about some of those very issues. Ball of Confusion, that's what the world is today, the Temptations. The idea of using rock and roll as a mouthpiece or uh, a loudspeaker for issues of import to society. This had gotten traction in the mid 60s, really taken on its own element in the late 60s as a result, largely of the Vietnam War, but not exclusively. And now in the early 70s, the thing that was really taking the focus was kind of a what's happening to us at home and who are we becoming as a result of it. Temptations, great. Santana, uh, they were probably the first act in rock history that really blended classic Latin rhythms with rock and roll rhythms and did so successfully and put out just a great product. This is the same Santana that would release a song called Smooth in 2000 and Maria Maria. It's the same band, same guy, Carlos Santana, great guitar player, and his band that carried and carries his name. Santana here from 1970, a song called Hoy Como Va. Great song, great song. 1970, metal music was starting to take on a life. Metal music, extra hard rock, electric guitars, a sound and a content and an energy that was much closer to the edge than, say, Led Zeppelin. It was to a degree the Who, but then it was different because the Who was not an electric band. And metal band, the Who was not a metal band. I'm sorry, of course they were an electric band, but they weren't a metal band. The the metal band came around in 1970s, a band called Black Sabbath. Lead singer Ozzy Osbourne. As metalheads will tell you, Black Sabbath is the holy grail. They are the apex. They're the first really great metal band that crossed over in popularity and forged a place for lots of bands that would come after them, most notably bands like Metallica. This is Paranoid. It's Black Sabbath. Paranoid, Black Sabbath. It's a great song. Um, the singer songwriter movement was very popular in the early 1970s. The singer songwriter, it was the idea of people performing their own songs, being writers, singers, and musicians. The main kind of folks who were this of the singer songwriter crowd: James Taylor, Carly Simon, Carole King, our old buddy from the Brill Building, and Joni Mitchell. Why do I have a fifth finger? I'll put in Jackson Brown. It was that idea that write your own songs, sing your own songs, record your own songs. And Joni Mitchell, poof, again, one of those artists that goes down as one of the great rock and roll artists of all time. Uh, Recorded music that was a fusion of jazz, rock, pop, the blues, and Big Yellow Taxi, one of her classic records. This is Joni Mitchell. Great. Joni Mitchell, Big Yellow Taxi. James Taylor, another member of the uh, singer-songwriter crowd. Fire and Rain, hugely popular record for James Taylor in 1970. Take a listen. James Taylor, great stuff. And James Taylor would also be famous for recording a song called You've Got a Friend, which we'll get to in a second. But first, let's talk about Carole King, because Carole King, already by 1971, Carole King was a music industry superstar as a songwriter. She and her then husband, Jerry Goffin, had written tons of rock and roll hits. And we've heard, The Locomotion and Up on the Roof. They also wrote, One Fine Day and Will You Love Me Tomorrow? Lots. Natural Woman for Aretha. Lots and lots and lots of standards. Carole King decided to release an album herself in 1971. It was not the first album that she had released, but this was going to be a really personal album. She would write all the material, record the material, and play piano. And the album was called Tapestry. Tapestry was released in 71 and it became an enormous, enormous album. And it was enormously popular. It spent six, is it right? 6 years? 6 years on the chart. Um, Went to number one and sold millions and millions of copies. And the first song that was released from Tapestry was this. It's a song called "It's Too Late," huge hit record in '71. Carole King. Great, great bluesy pop song, Carole King. But Tapestry was an important album because this was, I think, really the first time that that a female artist in rock history really released an album that, again, just like Rubber Soul and Revolver, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, it was an album that sort of worked as an entire piece. And she grabbed the consciousness, but she remained a rock star and she remained a musician of quality and integrity. And she opened the door for a generation of not just female artists, but quite frankly, I think girls and young women sort of saw themselves in a different light as a result of Tapestry. The music it contained and the success it obtained sort of said, this is possible. Remember, it was only 9 years before this that It's My Party was the sort of standard kind of song that women were singing. And now Carole King Tapestry changed everything. Tapestry would remain, in fact, the largest selling album by a female vocalist until the days of Whitney Houston. And one of the songs that Carole King recorded on Tapestry was a song called You've Got a Friend. And she did a version of the song herself, but her buddy, James Taylor, recorded the version, immortalized it in a number one single. But let's listen to Carole's version from Tapestry. This is You've Got a Friend. Great, great song, great song. Carole King from Tapestry, You've Got a Friend. I would say Tapestry is when you talk about the most important albums ever by a female artist in rock history, Tapestry is right there. It's right in the mix of the most important. Anyway, that's it for now. See you on the other side.